Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra.
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people
Associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked,
and sometimes what didn't,
you will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts
And inspire you to do even greater things.
Before we jump into today's conversation, a special thanks to PM Power Consulting for encouraging and supporting this show right from the start. With over 1,000 person-years of collective experience, PM Power has helped many organizations, teams, and individuals chart out their own journeys of excellence and make progress. Thank you, PM Power. Now, let's move to today's episode. In this episode, I am in conversation with Mike Maynard, the Managing Director and CEO of the Napier Group, a public relations firm. Mike shares his unconventional career journey from electronics engineering to marketing and recounts his initial interest in mathematics and eventual pivot to electronics engineering, sparked by a school project. Despite enjoying engineering, he realized his strengths lay in explaining technical details rather than executing them, leading him to roles in technical support and eventually to marketing. Mike discusses the lack of planning in his career and how opportunistic decisions led him to buy a tech agency before the dot-com crash in 2001. He elaborates on the challenges and importance of bridging the empathy gap between engineers and marketers, emphasizing communication as a crucial factor. This conversation also explores the impact of regulatory processes on hardware companies, the importance of diligent marketing in the age of AI, and the evolving landscape of B2B podcasts. Mike wraps up by offering some career tips for those transitioning to marketing, underscoring the value of data analysis over traditional creative skills. In fact, he said, master Excel to master marketing. Very interesting conversation. Listen on. Hi, Mike. Welcome to the Software People Stories.
Hi, Shiv. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, I've been very curious, but we have had a few people who've not been in the core software development space, but who have been in the marketing, sales, or HR, and others who've been supporting people who've been developing IT-based solutions. So I'm really excited. I do have a lot of questions, but before we get into that, we'll start with your origin story and how you got associated with technology and what has been the things that you've been doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a kind of long story. So at school, I was always going to do maths. I was never going to do engineering. And just before I had to apply for universities, the school decided rather crazily that they'd let a few students build a new desk for the lighting system for the theatre. So I got involved in that. We built the lighting desk. It was, such an exciting, interesting project. I thought, this maths thing's not so good. So I decided to study electronics engineering, and I basically came away with a master's degree in electronics engineering. I worked in a couple of design roles, and I kind of began to realize that whilst I enjoyed engineering and I was fascinated by it, I wasn't actually that good at it. I was really good at talking about it, but I wasn't really good at doing it. And the detail was certainly an issue that I kind of struggled with from time to time. So I moved into applications engineering, so basically technical support. Worked for a couple of companies doing that for a while. And then realized that, I was running a European team. What was the next step? Well, in my case, it was probably go to the States. I had a young family. I didn't really want to move out of the UK. So I thought I'd switch into marketing, had an opportunity to do that in the same company, switched into marketing. And you can see there's no planning in my career at all here. It's just kind of, taking opportunities. Because about 5 years into my career as a European marketing manager, I got a call from the agency I was using where they said, look, the founders want to retire. We think you should buy the agency. And I just thought, that can't be that hard to run an agency, having literally never spent a day in an agency before, which on reflection was probably a little bit too relaxed and a little bit too unplanned. And so I decided to buy a tech agency. I also decided to do that about 3 weeks before the dot-com crash in 2001.
Oh,
And, you know, it doesn't matter what you do. And I remember actually previously I'd done an MBA. And one of the lecturers said, you know, you've got to remember that something nobody ever tells you, you know, in these academic things is timing is really important. Well, I can tell you that lecturer, he was right, because, you know, buying a tech agency just before the dot-com crash was a bad idea. But we managed to cling on to the business, got through there. And since then, we've grown, we've built the agency up. And now the agency, which is still 100% focused on tech clients and purely business to business. So it's a mix of basically hardware and software clients. You know, that agency is doing well, and I've now sold it to the employees. So now we're employee-owned business.
oh, wonderful. Yeah. Interestingly, when I was looking at your client portfolio, I could recognize one name that I was also associated with many years ago, 24/7.
Yeah, okay. So we worked for quite a while with 24/7. Fascinating company who I think actually, I mean, for people who don't know, 24/7 is basically a customer service company. So they built their business on effectively a bunch of call centers they acquired. But they always had this model of moving people to self-service and automation. And I think, you know, as a business, it's taken longer than they expected. But I think now's currently the time where, you know, really they can benefit from AI and the introduction of technology. So they're a very interesting business. They're a great client for quite a while.
Yeah. Okay. So this shift to marketing, when you said it was kind of an opportunistic decision and you got in there, was there any mind shift change that you needed from being an engineer, whether it was the lighting system or solving specific problems, which are probably more definable, to something a little fuzzy like marketing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a massive change from engineering to marketing. So to some extent, I kind of made the move into technical sales, which helped. So engineering is very, very planned if you do it well. If it's not planned, it normally means something's gone wrong with the project. So you know, that's never a good thing. So normally you've got a view of what you're going to do looking forward. What I realized moving into the technical sales role is that a lot of jobs are not like that. And so sales is particularly reactive. And obviously, you know, you are trying to build plans, you are trying to grow particular accounts. But actually, a lot of sales was reactive, particularly technical sales, because there's engineers picking up the phone to you and they're asking you questions. So at the time, for example, I was supporting a range of MIPS processors. So got a lot of people with both hardware and software questions, you know, just trying to get the processors working. So you suddenly realize you go into a more reactive role in sales. And then marketing is a little bit different because sales, it's obviously very one-to-one. And in fact, my biggest problem in technical sales was balancing the time I spent on large customers with the time I spent on small customers, because the small customers weren't going to drive you revenue, but they were obviously going to drive, you know, a lot more reputation in the industry. And some of them were fun. You know, I mean, a couple of my small customers that I work with, they were Formula One companies. So, you know, you got really exciting, you know, small companies. Some of the bigger companies, you know, in terms of communications infrastructure, yeah, they're interesting, but it's not Formula One. So, you know, it was a balancing those sort of companies. And then you go to marketing and you have much less ability to actually see what the impact is, certainly directly. So I think one of the great myths of digital marketing is that digital marketing is fully trackable and monitorable. And actually, the truth is it's not. You get lots of numbers, but a lot of those numbers actually don't mean anything in the real world. And so you hear people talking about vanity metrics, and that's really, really true. And it's really hard for an engineer to understand that, you know, for example, you're measuring clicks, but there's actually a baseline of clicks you're going to get whatever you do, which is due to bots and things like that. So a real big shift in mindset for both those big career changes.
Yeah. So when you talk about engineering and marketing shift, usually one also finds some kind of a friction between the developers or the engineers and the marketing and sales. How do you handle those kinds of say reservations?
Well, I mean, I think for me it's a lot easier because I've been there. I've understood what the problems were. Um, I mean, I just went to see one of our clients who developed electronic components. Um, and I was able to use one of my favorite lines with clients when they're talking about timescales, and I just say, well, none of our other clients ever have product delays. And there's this fraction of a second where people think, is he serious? And then everyone laughs. Because the reality is that, in these big complex projects, you tend to have delays. And also, there tends to be delays introduced for commercial reasons as well. So what I can do is I can actually look at that from the point of view of having been one of those engineers involved in projects and seeing really, really good reasons why projects get delayed. And I think marketing gets frustrated. It's just like, well, didn't you know there was a big trade show coming up and we're meeting all these journalists and say, why don't you just organize all your development schedules around the trade show? And the answer is, the engineers probably would have liked to have been told that by marketing at the start of the project. But also it's not that easy. So I think I can understand from both sides, and that really helps in terms of kind of bridging that gap, because there definitely can be friction. You're absolutely right.
So how do you usually overcome this, call it empathy gap, or each side understanding the other better?
So that's a great question. I mean, the answer is to get them talking rather than to get them basically, ignoring each other. So, I think if I go back to the trade show example, marketers quite often want to launch something on a trade show. It's great because there's lots of customers there, there's lots of journalists, you can get lots of excitement. It's not always the best place to launch, by the way. That's a very different discussion, but it feels good for marketers to do that. And actually, if they have nothing, then obviously the trade show then becomes rather expensive and not as exciting to customers. So there's real benefits in doing it. If they're expecting a product and it doesn't arrive, then typically what you have is just the marketers going, it's a disaster, we can't do anything. And there's a lot of frustration and a lot of feeling of not being able to control what's going on. And I think what you need to do is really get the two sides talking and get engineering explaining what's gone wrong. And you need to get marketing understanding why there were risks. And let's be honest, maybe it's not going to fix this trade show. Maybe you are going to have a trade show with no big announcement and everything's going to feel a little bit underwhelming. But next time, marketing will get their act together and they'll make sure they've got something in backup. So if your major announcement doesn't happen, they've got an alternative or they've got a secondary plan. And so next time it will be less painful. And I think it's all about talking about and understanding it. I mean, I remember once I was in working in a semiconductor company, and we had this really, really important chip that was being developed, and it had to come out. It's actually really for a customer, but there was also a product launch planned as well. And the chip came back, the first chips came back, and they plugged them into the board. And most engineers have seen this at one point or another. They plug the chip into the board, and the smoke starts coming out as the chip pretty much catches fire. And it all goes wrong. And as it turns out, the cause was a problem with one of the design tools had basically corrupted the file. Nothing to do with any engineers, nothing anyone could predict. It was really unfortunate. And I think these things happen, and you need to understand that as a marketer, you think engineering is completely controlled and always going to happen. And actually, if there's a delay, the engineers plan that from day one. It's not true. There's lots of risks, lots of variabilities. And I think, getting marketers to understand that is really important.
Yeah. Just like the DevOps movement, I might have heard of that, where trying to get the developers and the operations people talking to each other. Do you think something like that is possible between developers and marketers?
I think it actually happens today. I think really good companies get the developers and the marketers talking together, and obviously, typically that's through kind of a product marketing role. But in the best companies we work with, absolutely, the marketers are talking to the developers all the time. And so they do get a picture of what's going on. And I'm not saying they don't get frustrated, but they do kind of understand, and they get they get to feel when the engineers are under pressure before they actually hear of, delays in the project. So I think the best companies do that. And the more you can break down these barriers, the better. I think the companies that struggle the most are the very siloed companies. And to be honest, you can see that in marketing because they'll have very, very siloed roles. And so the PR team will be doing one thing, and then the marketing automation team will be doing another. And they could be going off in completely different directions, and nobody cares because they're two different divisions. And you know, in that company, they're also not talking to the engineers. Whereas where you see the marketing teams working together, generally speaking, they're also working quite closely with the engineering teams. And it helps everybody. The engineering teams get a feel of, how their product's being promoted. That's much more satisfying to see that. But also the marketers really understand the benefits of the product. And you really only get that by talking to the engineers and digging. Just seeing a list of features isn't the right way. So, I mean, hopefully more and more companies will do it, but certainly there are some great companies and some of our clients already doing that really well.
Yeah. Since you mentioned you work with both the software and hardware companies in tech, the cycle times and the lead times in hardware, particularly supply chain dependencies or trying to get local certifications and so on, so many factors being outside the control of the team that's working on it. How would marketing be prepared to handle either delays or sudden surprises, like you said, something that went up in smoke and things like that?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Shiv, because there definitely is a lot more stages. And let's be honest, when I talk about hardware companies, they're pretty much all hardware and software companies now. I mean, very few people are selling just hardware. So software is a key part of it. So the hardware companies have got effectively two elements, the hardware and software, whereas a pure SaaS company, for example, they don't really have to worry about the hardware. It's sat on a server somewhere on the web. So sorry, you asked about, how do they deal with these issues? It's really hard, and we see, particularly with regulation, things changing. I would say it's much better, though, than it was maybe 25, 30 years ago. So if I look back then, one of the big things that came in maybe 30 years ago, perhaps 40 years ago, actually, showing my age, was EMC testing, so electromagnetic compatibility, basically not generating interference. And when it first came in, it terrified engineers. I've got to be honest. Hardware engineers were terrified because they weren't used to designing for it. And so what happened was you sent your equipment off, it got tested, and then a lot of the time it came out with, no, it's failed. And you're sat there going, what do I do now? Now today it's much, much better. So people understand the legislation, but they also understand the process. And there's a lot more products designed to support, getting certification. And I think if I look at that, if I look at automotive, which is very highly regulated, I think hardware engineers have really understood how to build certification into their processes. So although it's a problem and it's a big risk, it's actually much less of an issue now than it was, a couple of decades ago. And I think hardware, increasingly is being developed more and more quickly. So again, a lot of products, and I probably shouldn't say this, but a lot of products are pretty much standard hardware, and all the differentiation is software. So again, because you're maybe buying in the processor as a processor card, rather than buying a chip and mounting it down and trying to make it work. So you're tending to buy hardware modules and subsystems. Actually, there's not as much hardware being developed. It's much easier to manage. So I think the hardware guys have really got on top of the situation, and it's much less of a problem than people imagine.
A related thing possibly is, since you also mentioned automotive, the cost of recalls, right? Which probably becomes a disaster that PR has to handle. So how do you kind of handle that? Because your messaging and all that would have been based on some assumptions, and when this happens, What I'm trying to understand is the stress levels of the PR team.
Yes, that's an interesting question. I mean, the honest truth is with a lot of our clients, because we're supplying components, they go to the automotive tier ones. The automotive tier ones then sell subsystems into the automotive manufacturers. A lot of our clients don't necessarily get the PR, the blowback from that. They do commercially get huge costs, which is the issue. So from us, from a marketing point of view, it's not huge. I think what's increasingly happening is that there's so many recalls happening that they're not making as much news as you think. There's a lot more problems that go on that kind of fly under the radar. There's one or two, big issues. And obviously, if you have a recall around a braking system, that's a massive problem that tends to make news. But what we're seeing is more and more, partly due to the introduction of standards and processes to follow, and partly due to the fact that manufacturers do understand the cost of recalls now, that actually the engineers are much better at designing products that don't go wrong. And I think when it goes wrong, it's usually as much a cultural problem as it is actually an engineering problem. And I think, and I hate to pick a company that's struggling, but Boeing is a good example. We don't work with Boeing, so I've got no inside information. But we can see definitely there was a culture of actually, trying to push projects through at the risk of making mistakes. And I think that's come back to bite them.
Yeah. So that's interesting. That's probably a nice segue into the next thing that I was curious about, which is what we call as either lean approaches, like the lean startup and others saying that break things fast. How does that kind of an approach fit into building a reputation, sustaining a reputation?
Yes, so that's really interesting. I mean, the first thing to say is the lean and the agile approaches. Marketers are trying to get into those sort of methodologies. And I would argue in 95% of the cases where, for example, a company says they're running agile marketing, they're not really. They're trying to be a bit more flexible, and that's what they mean. Whereas I think in engineering, it's got a very precise definition. So, marketers, if you're listening to this, try and be a bit more precise in your definitions and try and put more process in. It will really help. But I think what you're asking about is, companies can change direction quite quickly because they want to be lean, they want to be responsive to the market. And I mean, the simple answer to that, Shiv, is it's really hard for marketing. Marketing is tricky because it takes a long time to build a brand and build a position. It's a lot about reputation, and it's a lot about repetition to drive that reputation. And so you work on, establishing a position and a direction for the company for, 6 months, a year, 2 years, and then suddenly the direction changes because the company's responding to the market. And that's tough. And there's no, I'm going to have to be honest, there's no easy answer to this. The answer is you have to then, rebuild. Obviously, positioning the company around problems it solves rather than how it solves it, is the way most marketers are addressing this. And I think, it sounds a bit crass now to think about things in, from your customer's perspective, but that's really how people solve this. If you're talking about solving problems for a particular customer, doing particular things, then in some way, how you solve it is less important. It's much easier to pivot.
Yeah. See, the city where I'm in, Bangalore, has a lot of startups, and particularly the tech startups. And some of them I've come across also naively believe that once they launch, they become a unicorn. But there are others who say that, yes, we need to run for a while, but still the patience to wait for maybe 7 years, 10 years is not there. So when that happens, it sometimes appears that it is just a lot of hype that is being built. So consequently, they say, no, I have a very good technically sound product, but why are people not taking it? Is this something that a marketing approach can be aligned to something like this?
There's a couple of great questions in there, Shiv. I mean, I didn't visit Bangalore. I went to India about a year and a half ago,
Okay.
and to me, the just the atmosphere, the feeling in India is like the feeling in Silicon Valley in the early 90s. There's so much optimism, so much positivity, so much willingness to take risk. It's a really exciting country, but you've also got the downsides of Silicon Valley. And I think in those early days, people were throwing money at ideas. And to some extent, they're doing it more in the software than the semiconductor markets now. But, I think people give up too early. People try and change and pivot too quickly. They expect overnight success. I don't think that Bangalore's any different to Silicon Valley was. I think that's is the situation. I mean, the answer is you've got to have a big plan, and you've got to realize that there are a million overnight successes out there that took 10 years to build or 20 years to build. And the people who really win out, in the majority of cases, and obviously there's a few very well-known exceptions, but in the majority of cases, they've been building that business over a period of time, and they get to the point where they can then get that exponential growth. And I think, founders need to understand that it's not smooth. I mean, we worked, with an AI startup that was amazing, mainly based in India, actually, because obviously incredible engineers. And I think, whilst I can't give any details, they went through some really, really bad times. Some times where I've got to be honest, I talked to the CEO, I probably would have walked away myself. And he kept going and kept going and kept going. And they ended up with an amazing trade sale exit where they're sold for hundreds of millions of dollars. And their technology has been bought into a much larger company. They're going to be super, super successful. But you look back, nothing is smooth. And I think founders need to understand that. You've got to understand there's going to be a lot of tough days. I mean, 95% of your time as a founder is just grinding through those difficult days. 5%, really good positive days where you get big wins, but 95% of the time is going to be tough. And if you want to be successful, you've got to, grind through those difficult days because it's the only way to really build a sustainable business.
The other thing that I hear is this term, product-led, saying the product will take care of all the sales and marketing. Now, while I've seen some success in a few cases, primarily in the B2C kind of a segment, some of them also try to use that to create some magnets in the enterprise, saying, no, a lot of your employees are already using it. Why don't you have an enterprise and so on, license and so on? How do you think the B2B market should be approached?
That's a great question. It's such an interesting issue. I mean, I always find it amusing that product-led development, where people are saying you really don't need marketing, has so many people throwing so much effort into promoting that approach. You think, well, if that approach is so good, why do you all need to go and promote it? The answer is everything needs promotion. Product-led development's a great idea. I mean, building something people want, which is my simple definition of product development, product-led development. That's a really good idea for a business. So I think it's great. I don't think it really affects the need for marketing or not. I mean, we have a couple of clients. I mean, one I'm thinking of in particular. I sat down with somebody and I said, look, I'm going to be honest. You've got a bit of a problem here because your CEO basically believes that your products are so good that if engineers are not prepared to spend a week learning about how to use them and understanding what they are, and then working out how they're going to fit with their designs, they don't deserve to benefit from your products. And I think some people get into that sort of, very egotistical, my product's amazing. People, really should know and learn about it. Fine, do it. I mean, it's your business, but just don't expect to be successful because the best product-led companies have the best marketing.
That's a good insight. Yeah. So now the other thing which I hear about the people who are more technically oriented, mainly startups, who are more hands-on, heads down kind of people, they say that, well, do we really need marketing now with all this Gen AI?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is Gen AI is the biggest growth area for marketing. So, it's really interesting. And do you need marketing? Yes, absolutely. Why do you need marketing? Well, because it's going to help you grow more quickly. And I'm not going to sit here and say if you've got a great product, you're never going to grow. That's ridiculous. Of course you are. Even if you don't invest in marketing. But you choose. Do you want to grow more quickly or more slowly? And the best companies combine great products with great marketing. Good companies, average-ish companies have got good products, maybe great products and not quite so good marketing. And then, of course, if you have no marketing and poor products, then you're really in trouble. So, I mean, there's definitely a league table. But why would you spend money, developing a great product, making something that people really want, and then have a whole bunch of potential customers not know about it? And the reality is when you look at, the research, the actual awareness of products, particularly in B2B, is very, very low. You'd be horrified at some, almost household name products where some people don't really feel that they're at all familiar with them. And so why wouldn't you tell people about great products? I mean, having a great product is actually going to make your marketing a lot easier. It's going to make it more effective for every dollar that you spend. I don't see why you wouldn't mix the two together and be more successful.
Because what I hear as some of the reservations are that, if I want to get some good copy, I can use Gen AI to do that. If I want to do some market research, if I want to segment, if I want to research about my customer or a prospect, I can use Gen AI. Or even for making pitches, I saw one person who said, okay, this is the company we want to approach, and this is our product, this is our value prop. Tell me what should be the line of pitch. So in this, is that affecting the more professional, established marketing and PR agencies?
Absolutely, Shiv. I mean, it is a great point. So, Gen AI is helping, but it's not replacing. So I'm sure, there's a lot of people who are quite technical listening to this podcast. They understand, and the name of the guy who came up with this theory has gone away. But basically, the trained neural networks, the AI models, tend to approach the average person in the industry and not quite make it. And the reason for that is that, they're basically statistical models. They're throwing back things that are most likely. So if you're looking to develop, marketing using Gen AI, it's really helpful. But what it's doing is it's giving you information that's based upon what's already been done. The completely new, completely revolutionary insight doesn't come. And so we use Gen AI a lot. It speeds up what we do. We do more work for our clients for the same amount of money, but it doesn't replace that human point of view. Maybe there's some people working in marketing who are below average who probably should be replaced by Gen AI. I don't want to say that. My favorite thing in the business, if I got 4 people talking about Gen AI, I said, well, of course, Gen AI is about the average person. So 2 of the 4 of you are safe in your jobs. And everyone looks at everybody else and they laugh. And, but I think Gen AI is not, it's proving not to replace a lot of the creativity. It's absolutely replacing a lot of the grunt work. And it's doing, a huge amount to speed things up. And that is excellent. But I would say if you want great marketing, if you want something creative, then you really, really need to involve, people who understand it, who've got experience, and who can sit and come up with creative ideas. I mean, my example is, most people, when they first saw a technical article written by Gen AI, they were blown away. Pretty much everybody. If you're working at a B2B tech space, particularly, you see that Gen AI can write an article and you're like, that is absolutely incredible. You see the 4th one and you realize how close it is to the first one, even though you've changed the prompt. And suddenly you're like, yeah, okay, it's a bit generic. And I can see why it's Gen AI. And it's like, so, I think you've got to bear in mind it's a balance. Gen AI is a fantastic technology, but it's not going to, replace everything else out there in the world. It's going to replace a lot of stuff, but use it for what it's good at. Don't use it for what it's bad at.
Yeah, the other thing which I've heard is particularly the prompts are not clear, or if you go a little overboard, like creating videos or even audios, the impact of possible hallucination probably will push you more towards what may be labeled as a deep fake or something that is not true to whatever the message to be conveyed. Are there any guardrails that you would suggest for either the companies or for the agencies?
I mean, I think the guardrail everybody suggests, and really the only one you can have is check and make sure it's right. I mean, my favorite thing used to be ChatGPT 3.5. You used to ask it. So one of my hobbies is speed skating. So you used to be able to ask it, who are the greatest speed skaters in the world? And of course, it gave you a pretty good answer. But actually, Gen AI is quite suggestible. So back in 3.5, you used to be able to say, hey, what about Mike Maynard? Isn't he a great speed skater? And 50% of the time, it would come back with this story about Mike Maynard that was completely fabricated. The only thing that I'm holding on to for my speed skating career is that if you run a local Gemma model, so the Google Gemini run locally, that still does it. So that makes me happy. By the way, I am a terrible speed skater, so there's no question it's a complete hallucination. Hallucinations are definitely there, and hallucinations are quite often driven by suggestions in prompts, in my opinion, in marketing. And so the real risk you have is if you're trying to get Gen AI to hype your product and make it sound as good as possible, you actually stand a real risk of generating a hallucination because you're pushing it to do something that you want it to say. So I think the only thing you can say is check. I mean, there's nothing you can do to stop hallucinations. I mean, the recent academic research seems to suggest that there's always going to be hallucinations. So the only thing you can do is check at the end and go and correct them. And again, it means us humans, we still have a bit of a role in this.
Yeah. I also noticed that you have also been a podcaster for quite some time now. Where do you think the podcasting or the audio medium is there in the larger picture of marketing?
That's a great question. I think we're at a really interesting stage of podcasting. I think if you look at what's happened, and I'm going to talk particularly about podcasting in B2B now. You started 7 years ago. Pretty much nobody, a very small percentage of people were listening to B2B podcasts about their work. It really wasn't happening. That's changed. And a lot of people now listen to podcasts that really relate to their career, what they're doing. But the number of podcasts has exploded as people have seen that. And I kind of think, to use the cliche, we're at peak podcast now. I think what's happening is that a lot of people are running B2B podcasts. They're, and I talked to quite a few people that, see downloads in the hundreds, maybe 1,000, 1,500 per episode, depending upon, who they are and what they're doing. And maybe they're hitting 200. And you talk to me, you go, well, 200 listens, every week is pretty amazing. That's a lot of time. And of course, podcast stats are more reliable now than they used to be. So, if you get the downloads, it's much more closely correlated to listens. And they still go, yeah, but we want 1,000, we want 10,000, we want 1,000,000, whatever it is. I think that's going to be difficult for a while because it's so fragmented. I personally believe that, now's the time. You talk about people not being willing to, really keep going. I think the B2B podcasts that keep going now will come out the other side and be much, much stronger. I think we'll see a lot of people giving up because they don't hit their goals. Maybe they were unrealistic at the start. I don't see podcasts going away, but I do see the number of podcasts, particularly in B2B, reducing. It's just too many.
Yeah, at least one thing, this probably addresses the earlier Gen AI impact, that these are all real people, real conversations, real insights, right? You can't really fake. Of course, there are now podcast generators also, but then, in the B2B, probably that matters a lot, right? People that they can relate to who are guests or hosts.
That's so insightful. I think if you look at, I don't know, let's give an example of a white paper. Somebody puts their name to a white paper. They've probably read it, but they almost certainly didn't write it. Somebody's written it for them. I mean, I know people who've never read the quotes that they've supposedly said in press releases, and then they get asked about them and they're really surprised. So, I think a lot of written content is somewhat inauthentic because it's not a very personal view. I think the one thing that podcasts do, and I think the best podcasts do, is they talk about people and they get opinions. And the one thing that AI is not great about really is having opinions. Mainly because of the way that the content's generated. It's somewhat random. So a particular Gen AI will have, one opinion and they may have completely the opposite the next time you ask with a similar prompt.
Yeah.
Whereas people tend to be quite opinionated and they tend to be pretty fixed on it. So podcasts are really great for that authenticity. I mean, the obvious challenge of podcasts is that, it's actually quite a demanding thing from the listener point of view. It's quite a long amount of time to give up. So I think there's a little bit of a dynamic there, but I certainly agree with you. Podcasts have a great future. The issue is that so many people have thrown so many podcasts out there that at the moment, I think it's in an interesting state of flux. But I'm excited for the future.
That's a little reassuring. Because sometimes you do feel, oh, why am I doing this? Now it's been 7 years, and then looking at what more in terms of at least making the collective knowledge available to more people. So that kind of brings me to one of my favorite questions that I ask every guest is some career tips. If somebody wants to consider marketing as either a role shift mid-career, saying that I've done all these things, which are probably different things, can I do this? Or somebody who's aspiring to get into this, what would be your tips for both these segments of people?
I love that question. I used to lecture in public relations, and I'd go in and my first lecture, I'd say, right, I know some of you won't enjoy my lectures. If you don't want to turn up, that's fine, but I'm going to give you the most important tip now. So if you don't turn up, you still had the most important tip. And then I say, but I can tell you now, almost none of you will take any notice of it. And my most important tip for PR students was to learn Excel. And the reason is that actually PR agencies tend to run on Excel because they don't tend to have anything more complex, because PR people aren't naturally great numbers people, but also students aren't numbers people. They come from a written background rather than a numbers background. But you need to be able to analyze data in marketing today. So if I was talking more generally in marketing, I think it would be really learn to understand and analyze data. And I'm not talking about, tell me what the click-through rate was for that ad, because that's meaningless. Dig in and tell me what that ad did for my business. So what do you need to measure? What was the goal of the campaign? And then how can you get a measurement that is, and typically in marketing, we're not measuring exactly what we're trying to achieve, but we're measuring some sort of approximation to it. But get me a measure that says this has really worked. So, as an example, if you're, the classic B2B marketing campaign, you offer a white paper download or an ebook. Don't tell me how many clicks to the website. That's irrelevant. I mean, at least get me the number of downloads that you've got. And maybe if you can, tell me how many of those downloads were in your key target customers. And if you can, how many of those downloads actually result in opportunities for salespeople to follow up, or, even better, how much money that campaign generated. Now, obviously, the further you go and the closer you get to a real business result, the longer the time frame you're going to measure over. So there's pros and cons, but understand measurement and understand how you make an impact to the business rather than just your, marketing numbers.
Well, yeah, I thought it'd say something like you need to be creative, you need to have a good command of the language, and then all those kinds of things, have an eye for color, shapes, and so on. No, learning Excel. Wow. Maybe I could also try it sometime.
Well, I mean, the funny thing is, and the creative people freak out at the idea of having to learn Excel. But once you start explaining to creative people, well, this worked and this didn't work, and we found that when you do this, it was, suddenly they go, oh, I see, right, I could do this and I could do that. And so by getting that kind of data-driven approach, you're actually helping creative people. You're freeing them up, because rather than having a million ideas and then trying to pick it, which is what creative people do, they have way more ideas than they can ever implement. You're actually kind of directing them to the ideas that would be the best, the most effective ideas. And so creative people, they're still producing a million, but they can whittle them down a lot quicker. And it really helps them do their job better.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Mike. On that note, I think we are about coming to the end of this conversation, and it is really wonderful talking to you. And I wasn't sure, frankly, at the beginning as to what we would talk about, but then you made it so easy to understand and brought out the different challenges and how things have been addressed. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Well, you're very kind, Shiv, and you asked some great questions, which really helped. Thank you.
Thank you.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Anita for promoting the Software People stories.
If you like this episode,
Please subscribe on your favorite podcast client.
And spread the word in your network.
if you'd like to share your story,
Contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.